Now in this lecture we will learn graph terminology, which is very useful when dealing with graphs during the interview process. Now the first terminology is vertices. Vertices are the nodes of graph. So if you look at this graph over here, we can easily see that these nodes over here are called vertices. So in this case, in our graph, we have 5 vertices over here. So basically when we are discussing the example in our previous lecture, these are representing the cities from our previous example. Now the next terminology is edge. The edge is the line that connects pairs of vertices. So as we mentioned before, we have 5 vertices over here. So as you can see, in between some vertices over here, we have edge. So these lines over here are called edges. So here again, in our case, we have 5 edges over here. Now the next terminology is unweighted graph. Now a graph which does not have a weight associated with any edge, it's called unweighted graph. So as we mentioned before, these lines over here are edges. So if you see that there is not any weight that is associated with these lines over here, it means that this is unweighted graph. So you can see that we have only just lines over here, so we don't have any weight associated with these lines, so this is unweighted graph over here. Now then, the next terminology is weighted graph. Now in this case, a graph is called weighted in which it has a weight associated with any edge. So as you can see, as we mentioned before, we have 5 edges over here. Now in this case, for these 2 edges, there is weight associated with it. So you can easily see that from V to V2, we have an edge. So in this edge, we have 8 over here, which is the weight that is associated with this edge over here. And from V2 to V4, we have another edge. And in this edge also, we have weight associated with it. Now with this, we can easily see that if any of edge in the graph has a weight that is associated with it, in this case, we can call it weighted graph. Now the next terminology is undirected graph. So in case the edge of graph does not have a direction that is associated with them, in this case we are calling this graph undirected graph. So as you can see, in this case there is no direction between these vertices over here. So this means that we can go in either way. So we can go from V1 to V2 and from V2 to V1. So in this case there is no any direction specified, so that's why this is called undirected graph. So in undirected graph, we can go in both ways from any edge. Now, if there is a direction that is associated with any of edge over here, in this case, it's called directed graph. So here you can easily see that we have direction in this case. So from V1 to V2, we have only one way. So we can go from V1 to V2, but we cannot come back from V2 to V1. Now, in this case, here also we can go from V1 to V4, but we cannot come back from V4 directly to V1. Of course that in this case we can use V5, V3 and then we can come V1. But in this case there is no direct link from V4 to V1 because in this case this direction from V1 to V4 is one direction way. So that's why it's called directed graph. So let's continue to the next terminology. The next terminology is cyclic graph. If in a graph we have at least one loop, in this case we can call this graph cyclic graph. So here you can see that from V1 we can go to V2, then we can go to V4, then from V4 we can come back to V1 over here. So here you see that we have circle over here. So this means that this is cyclic graph. Now in this case we have 2 circles over here, so we have another circle like this from V1 to V4, then V5, then V3, then V1. So as you can see, we have 2 circles over here. So if in a graph we have at least 1 circle, it means that this is cyclic graph. Now the next terminology is acyclic graph. Now in this case, if there is no loop in a graph, in this case we are calling it a cyclic graph. So you can easily see that in this graph over here, in this example that we have shown over here, there is no cycle, so that's why this is a cyclic graph. Now the next terminology is tree. Tree is a special case of directed acyclic graph. So in this case, in case of tree, we have only one direction from any node to another node, so we cannot come back. We can only go in one direction, so there is no comeback. And here also there is no loop, so we cannot find any cycle over here in case of tree. So this means that tree is a special case of directed acyclic graph. Now with this, we have concluded all terminologies that are related to graph. So in this lecture, we have discussed these terminologies by showing them one by one with example. So hopefully everything is clear about graph terminology. So see you in the next lecture.